City of Phoenix has changed the name of First Street in downtown, and it was all in honor of Mercury star Diana Taurasi today. 7489 Taurasi Way was dedicated to the WNBA's all-time leading scorer. Diana Taurasi spent nearly a decade holding a record almost nobody talked about. 62 games to reach 1,000 points, 250 rebounds, and 250 assists. A combination separating complete players from great scorers. It survived injuries, rookies, and entire eras of the league untouched. Then Caitlin Clark returned from a season lost to injury. Caitlin Clark not playing in the Fever's next game. It's tomorrow at home hosting the Sparks from LA. Walked into a chaotic shootout and broke it in 54 games without anyone announcing it was close. No countdown, no fanfare, just history quietly rewritten in real time. What does it actually take to break a record nobody saw coming? Let us break down exactly how it happened in this video. The untold story of a record. Some records get chased in public. Fans count down the games. Broadcasters build entire pre-game segments around the countdown. And the moment the record falls, the arena erupts on cue. This was never that kind of record. The milestone in question measures something quieter than a scoring title. It measures completeness. A player has to score at an elite level, rebound at a rate rarely demanded of guards, and distribute the basketball better than most point guards in the league, and all three have to happen inside the same compressed stretch of games. It punishes one-dimensional talent and rewards players who cannot be boxed into a single skill. Why does a milestone built on three separate skills matter more than one built on a single category? Because in professional basketball, longevity favors specialists. But true dominance favors players who cannot be game planned around at all. For nearly 8 years, the fastest anyone had done all three simultaneously was 62 games, a mark set by Diana Taurasi during a career that eventually made her the league's all-time leading scorer. The first and still only player in WNBA history to surpass 10,000 career points. She's the GOAT for a reason. The Phoenix Mercury on a high after Diana Taurasi goes down in history for scoring 10,000 points. Taurasi built that record the way she built most of her career, methodically without fanfare, in an era before every stat line was tracked in real time across social platforms. There was no viral graphic counting down her progress toward it. There was no dedicated broadcast segment explaining why the number mattered. It simply happened the way most of her accomplishments happened, and the league moved forward without pausing to celebrate it. Why did a milestone like this sit almost unnoticed for close to 10 years? Because nobody was playing at a pace fast enough to seriously threaten it. Scoring guards who rebound at that rate are rare. Guards who also rack up assists at an elite clip while doing it are rarer still. The combination effectively asks one player to do a point guard's job, a wing scorer's job, and a rebounder's job simultaneously across months of professional basketball. Coaches do not build offensive systems around chasing this particular number because chasing it requires a skill set most rosters are not built to support in a single player, let alone sustain across an entire season. How many players across an entire league roster typically even have the physical tools to attempt all three categories at once? Diana Taurasi is one of the 10 athletes to watch in Tokyo. The 39-year-old basketball player is competing in her 5th Olympic game. Usually a handful at most, and fewer still who can sustain it across a full season rather than a hot stretch of games. Taurasi's mark stood not because nobody tried to threaten it, but because almost nobody in the league was built to try in the first place. It became one of those quiet records, deeply respected inside basketball circles, almost invisible outside them, the kind of number analysts reference in passing rather than headline entire broadcasts around. Basketball has a handful of these compound records scattered across its history. Thresholds that blend scoring with playmaking with rebounding in ways a single highlight reel could never capture. They rarely trend the way a scoring title does because there is no single moment to point a camera at. No buzzer beater, number 50-point outburst, nothing that fits neatly into a highlight package. The number simply accumulates quietly across dozens of games until one night it crosses a line nobody was watching for. Does the absence of attention make a record any less difficult to break? Not according to the players who actually chase these numbers behind the scenes. That silence is exactly what makes what happened next so jarring to look back on. A record that had taken nearly 10 years for anyone to even approach was about to fall in a game where the player chasing it was not even supposed to be the headline of her own night. Does a record's difficulty change based on how loudly it gets discussed or only based on the numbers required to break it? The numbers never cared about the silence surrounding them. They were simply waiting for someone fast enough to catch them. Whenever that player finally arrived on the scene, history returned with her. To understand how the record fell, the setting matters just as much as the final number attached to it. The player chasing it had not played a competitive game since the middle of the previous July. An injury had wiped out nearly the entire following season. You see Caitlin Clark pleading for a foul on the play, coming on the court after the buzzer to yell at an official. Clark clearly upset with the officiating. The kind of layoff that usually costs a player rhythm, timing, and conditioning all at once. The build-up to her return had stretched across an entire offseason with expectations climbing every week she stayed off the court. The kind of anticipation that tends to make a debut game feel heavier than it should. Anticipation like that usually works against a player rather than for them because it raises the bar before a single possession has even been played. Coming back from something like that, most players ease in gradually. Limited minutes, cautious rotations, a slow climb back toward game speed spread across several weeks of low-stakes basketball. How often does a player returning from a near-total season loss get thrown directly into the fastest, most chaotic environment the league can offer? Almost never. And yet, that is exactly what happened here. The return arrived in a season opener against a team that had spent its entire offseason building specifically to compete at a faster tempo. The game turned into a shootout almost immediately. Both teams trading buckets possession after possession. Both defenses struggling to slow anything down for more than a few seconds at a time. By the final buzzer, both sides had scored well over 100 points, a first for a season opener in the history of the league. Is that really the environment a player coming off a long injury layoff is supposed to thrive in? Logic says no. She's back. Fever star Caitlin Clark is ready to go for tomorrow's game against the undefeated New York Liberty. A chaotic pace, almost no time to shake off rust gradually, and an opposing backcourt clearly unbothered by the moment or the occasion. Would a cautious, low-pressure opener have made the milestone easier to reach? Or did the chaos of this particular night actually push the totals higher than a quieter game would have? There is no way to know for certain, but the numbers came exactly as they came. Inside the toughest version of the situation rather than the easiest one. On the other side of the court stood a rising counterpart of her own. A guard fresh off an off-season spent competing at the highest available level, and that opponent delivered a near-flawless shooting performance, connecting on the vast majority of her attempts while adding rebounds and assists of her own. The contrast between the two performances was immediate and obvious to anyone watching closely. One guard shot with near-perfect efficiency, and looked every bit like a player who had never left the court. The other shot well below her usual standard, turned the ball over more than she wanted to. Clark drives, spins, gets inside, gets the N1 layup to go. Fever cut it to 6 after the made free throw. And still walked away with the more historically significant night. How does a player have arguably the less efficient game of the two and still leave with the bigger headline buried inside the numbers? Because efficiency and history are not always measuring the same thing. This particular matchup has carried extra weight for a while now. Two young guards perpetually compared to each other since long before either wore a professional jersey. And this game only added another chapter to a rivalry that never needed manufactured storylines to feel real. Buried inside that chaotic, high-scoring, ultimately losing effort was a milestone nobody had flagged as being close. The record had not been mentioned once during the preseason. No countdown graphic, no pre-game notes built around it. It simply appeared on a stat tracker sometime in the second half. The way milestones tend to surface when almost nobody saw them coming. A quiet notification buried under headlines about a mid-game back adjustment. A missed game-tying attempt in the closing seconds. And a loss that would dominate the post-game conversation instead of the record that had just quietly fallen somewhere in the fourth quarter. How many milestones get buried entirely underneath a more dramatic storyline from the same night? More than fans probably realize, especially in games decided by a handful of points in the final seconds. Clark averaged 19.5 and 8 in her inaugural campaign, and she also led the league in assists. The record hidden in the loss. Strip away the noise of the final score and the box score tells a very different story than the loss alone suggests. 20 points, 7 assists, 5 rebounds. On the surface, a solid but far from spectacular stat line for a player of this caliber, especially set against a shooting night that was well below her season average from beyond the arc. Do modest individual numbers ever tell the full story of what actually happened inside a game? Rarely, and this box score is a clear example of exactly why. But those individual numbers were never the real headline of the night. The cumulative career total layered underneath them was. With that rebound, that assist, and those points added on to an already growing tally from her rookie season, the career totals crossed the full milestones simultaneously. And they crossed it in her 54th career game, 8 games faster than the mark that had stood for nearly a decade. Why does an 8-game gap matter so much in a league where full careers stretch across hundreds of games? If you're a Fever fan, the question of the night is this: will Caitlin Clark play tomorrow? She's been out since June 26th with a back injury. Because at this specific pace, in this specific combination of categories, 8 games is not a marginal improvement. It represents a meaningfully compressed timeline for a record that measures complete all-around dominance rather than a single skill in isolation. Compare it to a runner shaving seconds off a mark that has not moved in years. The gap looks small on paper and enormous to anyone who understands what it actually took to close it. Most milestone conversations in basketball focus on the moment a number is reached, but rarely on the road it took to get there. The games where a stat line looked ordinary while the underlying total kept climbing towards something historic without anyone tracking it in real time. How many milestones get reached quietly across a string of average-looking nights before anyone notices the total has changed the record books entirely? Most of them, if the player involved is not already being tracked for a specific number. The player accomplishing it did so despite a shooting performance well below her typical efficiency. Milling up to Clark. Clark takes her first shot, and it's a 3 and it is good. Despite a missed potential game-tying shot in the final seconds, despite a body that had visibly needed adjustment on the sideline mid-contest. Would this record have generated more immediate attention if it had come during a win on a night with a cleaner shooting line and no injury subplot attached to it? Almost certainly. But the version that actually happened carries more weight precisely because none of those easier conditions were present. None of that mattered to the stat sheet by the time the final numbers were logged. Does a milestone care whether the night around it was clean or chaotic? It does not. And that is precisely the point of measuring totals instead of moments. The record does not weigh whether the shooting night was efficient, or whether the final result favored the team on the scoreboard. It only asks whether the totals were reached and how many games it took to reach them. On that measure, there was no ambiguity whatsoever. No asterisk, no footnote required beside the number. A mark set roughly 8 years earlier had just been broken in a losing effort by a player who was not supposed to be the biggest storyline of her own return game that night. And yet, by the time the final horn sounded, she was exactly that. Whether the box score wanted to admit it or not. Losses get forgotten by the following week. Career pace records set inside those losses tend to stick around considerably longer. A couple of heated games and some rough plays this week have sparked a new controversy in the WNBA around superstar Caitlin Clark, quietly reshaping how a player's early seasons get remembered years down the line. The moment that went viral. Records like this one rarely generate an immediate wave of reaction precisely because they require someone to notice the underlying math before anyone can react to it at all. But this particular record did not stay buried for long. Word spread through basketball circles the way milestones tend to travel now. Not through a broadcast graphic during the game itself, but through statisticians and independent analysts flagging the achievement across social platforms within hours of the final buzzer. How does a milestone nobody planned for still end up traveling across the sports world within a single news cycle? Because the underlying story carried weight the moment the numbers were laid out plainly for anyone to see. One of the most recognizable figures in global sports, a basketball legend from an entirely different league, publicly acknowledged the achievement soon afterward. A small but telling sign of how far the moment traveled beyond the arena where it actually happened. Why would a figure with no direct connection to either player involved take the time to notice a WNBA milestone at all? Because the underlying story was bigger than a single stat line buried in a box score. A young player barely 2 seasons into her professional career, having missed nearly an entire year to injury, had returned and immediately erased a mark set by one of the most decorated players the sport has ever produced. That kind of contrast does not require much explanation to register as significant to anyone watching the broader landscape of basketball. Does a milestone need context to matter, or does the raw comparison speak for itself the moment it is laid out? Sometimes the numbers alone do all the necessary work without a single added sentence of explanation. Inside the league itself, the reaction ran quieter but no less notable. Analysts recalculating season-long pace projections. Broadcast teams rebuilding pregame notes to account for a milestone that had arrived earlier than any model had reasonably predicted. Milestone tracking itself has changed considerably over the years. This record stood untouched, shifting from something buried in post-game box scores to something calculated and flagged in real time by independent statisticians the moment a threshold is crossed. That shift alone explains part of why this particular achievement traveled as quickly as it did, even without a single broadcast planning for it in advance. This was not the first time this particular player's name had appeared in a record book during her short career. The rookie ledger already carried her name across multiple categories from her debut season alone. This for college basketball history. Caitlin Clark by far is the best defensive player we have seen in decades. Does one record falling early in a career make the next one easier to predict or simply harder to ignore? Every additional entry in the record book makes the next milestone watch a little more crowded. But this one hit differently because it was not a rookie record set against players still learning the league. It was a career pace record set against a certified legend, and it did not fall in a moment of peak health and full rhythm. It fell in the middle of the hardest possible circumstances anyone could have chosen to break it in, which is exactly why the basketball world paid closer attention than a quiet stat sheet update usually earns. Fan reaction followed a similar pattern to the professional one, arriving in waves rather than all at once, building steadily across the following days as more outlets picked up the story instead of exploding in a single instant. Is a record's cultural impact measured by how fast it spreads or by how long people keep talking about it afterward? This one leaned toward the second, still generating conversation well after the game itself had faded from the news cycle entirely. A broken record is rarely just about the record itself. It functions as a marker, a way of measuring exactly how fast the ground is shifting beneath an entire league. Diana Taurasi's mark stood for close to a decade, not because the league lacked talented players during that stretch. Diana Taurasi, widely regarded as one of, if not the greatest women's basketball player of all time, but because the specific combination of elite scoring, elite rebounding, and elite playmaking at that pace was simply that rare, even among generational talents who came through the league in between. For it to fall in 54 games, especially through a season opener overshadowed by injury recovery and a difficult shooting performance, signals something important about the current trajectory of the player who broke it. What does it say about a player's ceiling when her hardest possible night still produces a mark that took a legend roughly 8 years to reach? It suggests the difficult night was never actually the ceiling at all. Milestones reached under difficult circumstances tend to reveal more about a player's long-term trajectory than milestones reached under ideal ones. Every league eventually reaches a point where its longest-standing numbers start falling faster than the generation before it expected, and those stretches tend to mark the exact moment a changing of the guard becomes impossible to ignore, even for people who were not paying close attention beforehand. This record falling does not erase what it took to set it in the first place. It simply adds a second name to a conversation that used to belong to one. Legacy in this sport has never worked as a strict hierarchy where one name replaces another completely. It works more like layers stacking on top of each other, each generation building on totals the previous one left behind until the record book itself becomes a shared timeline rather than a single name attached to a single number forever. What happens when that same player returns to full health, full rhythm, and an entire season without the disruption of injury rehabilitation hanging over every single game on the schedule? Does a single milestone reached under the worst possible conditions even come close to predicting what a full healthy season could eventually look like? Not on its own, but it does set a floor. And floors set under difficult circumstances tend to hold up remarkably well once the circumstances actually improve. The record just broken may end up being remembered less as a peak achievement. She has officially broken Kelsey Plum's record from 2017, and more as an early marker on a much longer climb still ahead of her. Every era of this league has produced players who arrived and immediately made the record book feel outdated. History rarely stays still for long. Marks that once took the better part of 10 years to set are increasingly being reset in a fraction of the original timeline. And the players resetting them keep arriving younger with every passing cycle. That trend line rarely gets discussed openly, but it tells its own story about where the league is heading, one broken record at a time. Does the record book adjust its expectations after a moment like this? Or does it simply wait for the next player fast enough to rewrite it again? Whether this particular record stands untouched for another 8 years or gets seriously challenged again within the same season, one fact is now permanently on the books. Unaffected by the loss, the missed shot or the sideline adjustment that surrounded it. A mark that took a certified legend roughly a decade to build took less than 2 full professional seasons to fall. A single record has captivated really the audience the way that Caitlin Clark has captured the basketball world. is now attached to a name nobody expected to erase it this soon. Taurasi built that mark quietly and Clark broke it the same way. Buried inside a loss overshadowed by a sore back and a missed shot with no countdown to announce it was close. That is why it matters. The hardest nights reveal the most about where a career is actually headed. If this record changed how you see either player, drop a comment naming the one you think falls next. Like this video if these numbers caught you off guard and subscribe to Hoops Uncovered.